Okay, so Vampire Coast build basics. Going to start off with the core of your army that you see almost all the time. Basically, always take 4 deckhands and 2 bombers. If you are going up against any undead, you don't want scurvy dogs, but in all other cases, you'll want 1 or 2. For my playstyle, I typically like to take 2. Just because of how effective they are, but the micro can be pretty intense, so stick with the 1, and if you can keep them alive for the whole game, then feel free to take 2. Now, building up on top of that, you'll want to fill out the core of your army. That can be zombie deckhand mob polearms to make sure your front line lasts a little bit longer, or maybe even more bombers. And of course, you can also take handguns too. I think for a nice general layout, this is pretty good. You take 4 handguns, you'll have your dogs, some bombers to support. You don't want to go overkill on them, since people do know how to counter them now. And perhaps 1 or 2 extra polearms to defend your front line. I say front line specifically because you want to be holding back infantry with these guys. Cavalry circling around the back tends to be less of an issue. That will vary depending on how many handguns you have in the back. Now, for the lore choices, we have really 2 options, that being Luther Harkon and Count Noctilus. If you do take Luther, I recommend stripping him of all of his abilities and only taking them if you have extra money later. That is because they cost a lot of money, and Vampire Coast troops are efficient enough where you would rather have more things like handguns than abilities on Luther. And also, just remember, if you do take Luther, you'll want a fleet captain, which I also like to take with no abilities except for Invocation of Nehek, Drowned Dead, and the Curse of Undeath. Just trying to save as much money as possible. But if you like having a little bit more of a tankier hero, Rotting Promethean and the Hunger are good ways to go. As another bonus, Taunt only costs 63 gold, so don't feel too bad about taking that as well. And moving on to Noctilus, he's a nice option if you want to save a little bit of money. You can take him generally not on the Necrofex. And for him too, you'll only want a handful of abilities. Captain Roth's Moondial, you definitely want to take, just because of how cost efficient it is. You can see at 150 meters, you'll be able to catch archers with it, which is definitely a huge help. For spells, it's always Nehek and Drowned Dead, and abilities, Arcane Conduit, Wraith Storm, and of course the Curse of Undeath. You'll see that Noctilus is quite a bit cheaper than Luther and the Vampire Fleet Admiral, so he's a nice option if you want more troops. So on to the special units. For Vampire Coast, there are quite a few options, so buckle in as we dive into each sort of group of special units that you can take and what they specialize in doing exactly. So starting from the top, we have the Gunnery Wight, which I would recommend you take on a Rotting Promethean with no abilities except for Scabscrath, which is very cost efficient. You just need to make sure that you land the ability. So there we go. We have a little bit of anti-infantry killing power, but primarily you're going to take this guy if you want to deal with single entities. Specifically, single entity heroes. You don't have something like Luther to pick them off, but he'll also do pretty well against large targets too. The reason that I don't classify this guy as anti-cavalry, let's say, is mostly because his DPS is just a little bit too low for that. I would recommend some other options if you want to deal with multi-model units. Now for the other hero, we have the Moringal Haunter, who performs pretty well. As Aerocrastic has said in the past, it's sort of like a Vargulf. And yeah, that's about it. You use this guy for single entities too. Although I do prefer gunnery wights on crabs nowadays, I think the Moringal Haunter is still a great option, especially because of his chilling aura. But anyways, you'll mostly be taking this guy to deal with all those pesky heroes coming your way. Up next, we have Sirens, who I like to take in pairs, one for each flank, which I will usually use sort of like cavalry. They can fight and typically win against most other cavalry, and if the flanks are open, they are able to close in on archers. So very good if you want to be aggressive. Now after Sirens, you can go for a mass deck gunner style. These guys are great against single entities. They're great against cavalry too, and they also deal with archers. So honestly, a wonderful multi-purpose unit. The real reason that you wouldn't take them is because they are a little bit vulnerable in some situations, but typically more sturdy than your artillery. Just make sure that they don't get jumped on by infantry, and they'll do just fine in just about every situation. Now, of course, there are the Necrofex Colossi. You can take the normal one as an anti-cavalry option, or the Regiment of Renown one if you want to be routing off chaff. Very, very good against heavy infantry swarm armies, such as the Beastmen and Greenskins. For smaller monstrous units, however, there are always the Moringals, who fill a very nice general purpose niche. Sort of like the deck gunners, where they will hold their own against cavalry, and they'll also be able to deal with infantry too. Really, the one part that they fall off the most is single entities, so do be careful there. Now for the other two monsters of Vampire Coast, there is the Rotting Leviathan, which is very hard to kill, and it'll do pretty well against cavalry and single entities, but not extremely. So primarily you'll be using this as a disruption tool, sort of running amok in the back lines of your enemies, as it's a pretty expensive defensive unit and it'll take a little bit too long to kill cavalry. But if you want to rush or jump on top of archers, this is your monster. For single entities, however, not much will do better than the Terrorgeist. Typically don't see this too often, since it comes in the form of Luther, where you will typically save a little bit more money, but for whatever reason, if you want to take Noctilus instead, this is a good option for those single entities. Aside from that, it doesn't really help out in many other situations, but if there's a lot of chaff you need to kill, the Terror will help quite a bit. But for more anti-cavalry options, there are Rotting Prometheans. You can take the normal one or the regenerating Regiment of Renown one. These guys are mostly there to deal with cavalry, so you'll see them against factions like Bretonnia, and they will stand up pretty well against archers. More of a defensive unit though than anything else. If you want an aggressive unit though, I would recommend the Deck Dropper Selection. You can go light on it or extremely hard with 3 Deck Dropper handguns before I feel like you're getting a little bit unreasonable. These guys can be countered, so do be careful with them. But with enough micro, this selection will be able to deal with single entities, cavalry, and even infantry. Deck Dropper Bombers are pretty proficient there, but not as cost effective as the other units. I would say take these ones a little bit more sparingly. For artillery options, we have the usual anti-archer selection. I would recommend deck gunners over these, just since artillery is a little bit more vulnerable to spells like fireball and its similar counterparts. But if mortars are the way you want to go, feel free to take them. If you want to deal with cavalry, carronades are a good selection too, along with many of the options of Vampire Coast. Just be careful not to go too hard on artillery, as you can be overrun by infantry. And last but not least, you can also take Queen Bess, who specializes also, sort of in the same way as mortars, anti-infantry. Although it is very expensive and pretty easy to snipe, so I wouldn't really recommend taking this unless you're prepared for the risk. So there we go. That is the Coast roster. But if you're actually setting up a build, how do you choose from all of those specialist units? But typically what I do is I take my remaining funds and split it into 2,000 gold chunks. So with a base army like this, you will typically have about 4,000 gold left. And what I do is I typically go for 2 groups of specialist units, making sure that I cover anti-single entity, archer, and cavalry threats where they might exist. So for example, if I'm up against a faction that could have all of those threats, I could take something like deck gunners to deal with archers and cavalry, and maybe something like 2 gunnery wights on crabs to deal with those single entities. Something like this would feel pretty safe against quite a few factions. So as another example, maybe you want to go for a heavy Cyrene build. Can take 2 of them, which is pretty safe, but you do leave a little bit of a gap in your build. You know that these are good against archers and cavalry, but not so much against single entities. So to solve that, you can take something like a Terrorgeist. Although most of the time I would sub out Noctilus for Luther, but this works too. So let's say instead you want to use the Gallows Giant, and single entity heroes are not much of a problem. And single entity heroes aren't as much of a problem, then you could take something like the Lamprey's Revenge to deal with cavalry, and maybe just a pair of deck droppers to deal with any heroes that might come your way. And yeah, that's about everything you need to know to make a Vampire Coast build. You start off with your base, and then you fill it out based on what you might expect. So let's say we are expecting a bunch of monstrous units and infantry. Well, you can take some deckhand polearms and bombers. Next, you choose your lord. So I might choose something like Harkin with no abilities, followed by a fleet captain, also stripped down to cost as little as possible. Next up, we choose from our specialist units. I have about 5,000 gold, which means I can choose from 3 categories. Maybe I'll take a gunnery wight to really make sure we're not worried about single entities, and 3 deck gunners to deal with archers, followed by the Lamprey's Revenge to stop any cavalry that tried to go on the deck gunners. So there we go, covering all of our fronts. And last but not least, seeing as I did forget something, we will be demoting one of these polearms so that we can take Scurvy Dogs, as they are a very nice unit to take in just about every matchup. So if you did find this helpful, do subscribe, and hopefully I'll be able to post more guides like this in the near future.